Joining me now from his home in Fort McMurray is my friend, good friend of the show, Robbie Picard from Oil Sands Strong. Robbie, it's been a while since we had you on the show, and I regret that deeply. But I wanted to have you on particularly today because you're such a strong advocate for Indigenous people and for job creation for Indigenous people and for Indigenous financial independence through partnerships with the resource industry. And yesterday, Justin Trudeau announced billions of dollars for Indigenous people for housing and mental health, $2 billion. And he says if he's reelected, he will give supports to First Nations, rural communities, Métis communities, and Inuit communities. And for me, I think this is just so insincere, considering Justin Trudeau also promised to end boil water advisories on Canada's First Nations communities, and yet 50 still remain. So I'd like your feedback on the issue.
When it comes to Indigenous issues like boil water, proper housing on reserves and stuff, I think the issue needs to be solved from the Indigenous communities, period. And that's from economic opportunities and not just money that they've thrown at the problem over and over again. What happens in Fort McMurray with our Indigenous communities is that I just drove through one the other day and they're thriving, right? But that's because they have businesses and employment directly connected to the energy industry. And I don't want to say that it's a bad idea to help, but this last, God, I don't know how long it's been now, like almost 8 years of this has just been constant. How long has he been prime minister for?
6 years. I know it feels longer.
Yeah, 6 years. Yeah, so 6 years. That's a long time because I remember the night that I remember that election night. So it's kind of weird how the world's been a blur. But there's been so many empty promises from Prime Minister Trudeau. I mean, we were supposed to have a balanced budget. We're supposed to have this and that. None of it came true. What scares me about elections is that it's really just promise something and don't deliver seems to be the norm in this country. It also seems to be the norm that narcissistic people lead us, and I'm learning a lot about politics too because I'm working on a smaller level on the local campaign here. And bottom line is that I think that the only way for Indigenous communities and First Nations communities to fix problems is to do it themselves. And if you can't just throw money at the issue, the community itself needs to take ownership of this, and the government needs to provide those opportunities, that logistics, that support, and that training to maintain this. So I guess on one hand, I'm great if he promises this, but I don't particularly trust all the promises that he's made because he's made so many false promises over the last little bit here.
Well, and that's the thing, like he's making false promises to some of Canada's most vulnerable people when you consider just the rate of poverty on some of Canada's First Nations reserves. And you see the flip side of this. You live in Fort McMurray, where so many First Nations communities are wealthy. They're business focused, they're wealth creators, they're job creators, not just for Indigenous people, but for everybody. Because they're partnerships with oil and gas. And yet this is the same prime minister who says he's going to help Indigenous people while simultaneously phasing out oil and gas, which is, when you couple that with mining, the single largest employer of Indigenous people in the country. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that that's where the oil and gas is. It's out there outside of the big cities where the reserves are in rural Canada.
I think that we have a real problem coming down the pipe, so to speak, or not coming down the pipe, depending which way you look at it, with this whole nonsense of this just transition. There is such a pressure to damage Canada's oil and gas industry. And words matter. When the Prime Minister says stuff like, we'll phase it out, we'll do this, and there's these so-called green energy jobs that are going to be popping up everywhere, which we all deep down inside know what's happening. I think that the communities that will be affected by it the most are the Indigenous communities, and right now there's such a push for the Indigenous communities to get in oil and gas and get natural gas and pipelines and stuff, and that's taken many years, but it's starting to come around, especially in BC. I mean, BC here it's a little bit different. Our Indigenous communities here have been doing oil and gas for quite a while, so some of them are incredibly wealthy, and I mean incredibly wealthy.
Mm-hmm.
And in BC, it's a little bit different because their Indigenous communities have been shafted for so long. So they've never really had an opportunity to recently. And Fort McMurray is an example and a beacon for the rest of the country on how to do economic reconciliation. And so I think that there is no such thing as green energy. And I actually was reading an article last night about what happens to the batteries of these electric cars when they finally break down. And I would argue that we're headed for catastrophe. How do I say?
Catastrophe.
Catastrophe. I'm headed for catastrophe. We're headed for catastrophe if we go down this route and we don't have a plan to deal with the recycling of these lithium-ion batteries. So I think the world needs to pause. And honestly, I don't think oil and gas is that bad. And I'm proud that that I have a gas powered car and I bought a bus recently that runs on propane and gas, and I'm taking that to Ottawa fairly soon. I don't have the exact date yet, but I'm going to be going to Ottawa, and I'm going to be doing a documentary along the route, stopping in all different cities, talking about how oil and gas has changed the lives of Canadians. And honestly, like, if you look at plastic in the ocean, a good chunk of that comes from Haiti. And that's because they don't have the infrastructure, the fossil fuel network to handle their garbage. So they just pour it into the rivers, and that takes it into the ocean. And fossil fuels have made this world so much better, particularly in North America. And we have not done a proper marketing campaign to celebrate that and protect it. We have nothing to be ashamed of, but somehow, some way, we have told ourselves that what we're doing is bad. And I would argue that the future could be worse if we don't actually stop them from ripping apart perfectly good infrastructure, ripping apart perfectly good a good system that has benefited us all for so long. So I think that this virtual signaling and this social justice stuff just needs to end. There's not been anything better for Indigenous communities than oil and gas. That is the only thing that has been proven to work to improve the lives of their people, lift them up from abject poverty, take them up a level. And this messing with it and all this stuff that has been done by these so-called environmentalists has put us in this horrible position. So I'm not going to accept this notion that somehow, some way, some government bureaucrat or a government, you know, a person from any level of government is going to tell me that I need to give up my way of life for something better that doesn't exist.
If you'd like to get access to my show, as well as other great TV style shows too, like Ezra's Nightly, Ezra Levant Show, and David Menzies' Friday night show, Rebel Roundup, just go to rebelnews.com/subscribe. That's rebelnews.com/subscribe.